Back in 2016, I was at Schiit Audio's headquarters and I took a group pic with the guys, one of whom was holding a prototype of a yet unreleased product. Actually, it was a final production board. And for fun, I thought we'd put it on HeadFi and see how long it took people to figure out what it was. And of course, that product was the Modi Multibit, and it only took them pretty much a couple of hours before someone guessed. It was kind of pretty obvious. Especially given the attention people pay to Schiit Audio's products. But the thing is, what's the big deal about having a multi-bit DAC? Even one which I'm holding here, which is pretty small and actually the cheapest multi-bit DAC that I'm aware of. To give the answer to that, we have to go back actually into my audio history, back into the early 90s when I was a teenager. When I went into the local hi-fi store, we didn't have multi-bit DACs, we had multi-bit CD players, and pretty much all CD players were multi-bit at the time. And I remember the first 1-bit, or what we call Sigma Delta based CD players coming out. I think it was a Rotel or something like that, and I was comparing the sound to the 1-bit CD player versus the multi-bit version. I don't have many impressions particularly from that time, except that there was a slight difference between the sound of the multi-bit and single-bit players. But the thing is, now most audio reproduction is done through single-bit, 1-bit players, or what we call Sigma Delta digital to analog converters. So why is there such an interest in things like these multi-bit DACs? And why is this $250 versus the standard Modi, which is only $99. So for that, let's take a bit of a closer look. The main history around multi-bit digital to analog conversion is kind of a long one. Old multi-bit DACs were only capable of 16-bit and 48 kilohertz conversion. Actually, they were capable of higher, but since the DAC chips themselves only did the conversion and didn't do the processing of the input data, that required a separate chip, and due to the electronics available at the time, couldn't put through high-res data, and there weren't any really high-res files to put through. Pretty much the highest resolution available was what's called HDCD, which is no longer available, which is a high-resolution version of your standard CD. And now that being redundant, it's kind of irrelevant, but with high-res available, the multi-bit DACs quickly became fairly irrelevant in the audio world, but there are a lot of people really wanted that old sound back. Now I looked at an old multi-bit DAC, which was the Marantz Project D1 not too recently. It's one of the best sounding DACs I've ever heard, but again it's limited to 1648. The other thing I used to have was a Parasound DAC 1600 HD, an old and battered one I picked up secondhand, and it too was one of the nicest DACs I've ever listened with. And I do wish that I had that kind of sound back in my system. So in that, nowadays, if people want to make a multi-bit DAC, since all the chips are no longer available, the closest available being the half multi-bit, half single-bit Burr Brown PCM 1792 and 1793, what people do if they do want a multi-bit DAC and they do want that old school kind of sound? Well, the answer is either you make a DAC using a resistor ladder array on a board, or you do what Mike Moffat did, which was kind of unusual. He took industrial grade DAC chips and he made DACs such as the Yggdrasil, using DACs which are primarily used for motor control in expensive components such as MRI machines and missiles. Now these DACs of course translate a digital representation of a number into, say, a motor movement and have to be very precise. However, while they aren't designed for audio purposes, Mike Moffat did bend them to his will to do so, and they're available in 16, 18 and 20-bit versions. Now, the problem with a multi-bit or a ladder DAC, to get the kind of precision that you need for, say, 24-bit audio, is kind of impossible with a bunch of resistors. The accuracy required for digital to analog conversion for high-res material and 24-bit is kind of impossible with a bunch of resistors for reasons I'll go into in other reviews. But essentially, what you do with these is, this is only a 16-bit DAC, but in exchange you get that kind of old school sound that you get with old multi-bit DACs. Now I know Jason Stoddard has said that he actually uses a Modi Multibit on his desk, so why would you pay $250 instead of $99 for a DAC? Just for fun, I thought we'd have a look inside the Modi Multibit, and since people have been fascinated by what's inside them, it looks quite complex. Obviously there are a lot of components crammed into a small board, but it's kind of grouped into sections. On the left side we see the power supply, and the power supply requires some kind of regulation and filtering because I guess the wall warts are maybe to some degree slightly noisy. One of the important things is that digital components use very small voltages and currents, and which are obviously susceptible to noise, so power filtering is necessary. And when you buy a bigger, more expensive DAC, you are paying for bigger power supply with better filtering very often, which is a large degree of what's in them. Now we have the USB input, which has a C media USB chip in there, which was common on all Schiit audio DACs until the Generation 5 USB. Obviously, they're not going to fit a Generation 5 USB into this tiny chassis, so you just get the old C Media one. You can also see some shiny digital clocks. There's a couple, big one and a small one there, and a 12 megahertz clock just down here. And all digital components require clocking. So you also have the firmware chip here, which is a little sticker on it with the firmware in it. So when I upgraded my Yggdrasil, I had to switch one of these chips. So you also have a programming interface here too. It doesn't have a socket like some of the other DACs do. It just may have some kind of thing at the factory which they clamp onto there to program what's underneath. And what's underneath is the Analog Devices Shark, which is the DSP, which handles all the digital processing and uses the firmware from Mike Moffat and his programming that's installed on there to do the digital filtering for the chip. If I turn it upside down, you can actually read the lettering on it. You also see the larger traces for the power supply here as well. We have also an AKM chip here, which would handle the interface for the optical and coaxial digital inputs and convert it to something that can be processed by the DSP, and then that would go over to the actual DAC itself, which is the little Analog Devices DAC there, and it has some kind of programming or logical handling chips there, which I don't know in detail about. Maybe there's switches, considering it's a ladder DAC, I'm not sure. And that would be digital on one side and then analog on the outside, and then this is all analog processing for the output, I guess using maybe a couple of op amps and a buffer, possibly. I haven't looked up the numbers online. And that's your basic overview of the insides of the Modi Multibit. Do you like my stack of... Well, yeah. So why would you buy a Modi Multibit over the kind of regular $99 Modi? And it's a $150 premium for this very expensive industrial chip that may technically not measure as well when playing audio. So to kind of answer that question, I know that the regular $99 Modi uses a AKM DAC chip, and I know that I have a lot of gear here that uses AKM DAC chips, such as this VO Q5. And given that kind of all in all, it's fairly equivalent. I mean, it's a $350 odd product that is kind of equivalent to buying something like this $350 Audio GD, or getting a $350 stack with a Modi Multibit and Magni. So I used it and other devices to compare how like an AKM DAC sounds versus a multi-bit DAC that you get in these two setups. So in that, probably the best description I can say for that is that the multi-bit DAC sounded more musical. And what the heck does musical mean? It's kind of a meaningless term. Actually, it's more like I felt like I was listening to music more with the multi-bit DACs. Whereas with something like the Q5 and other devices that use AKM chips, the sound was less kind of engaging. It sounded more kind of flat. It took more of a step back from the music. It didn't seem a little bit duller, I'd suppose, compared to the multi-bit DACs, which were a little bit more musical. Maybe an easy comparison might be something like the Magni 3. There's a Magni 3, of course, is their new $99 amp. It's kind of basic in its design. I mean, you can easily hit maximum volume on it because it doesn't have that much gain, because it only has kind of very minimal design. So in that, I found that, it did a very good job of being a basically usable amp. But I mean, the kind of presentation of it was very kind of flat, like all the music came through as listening to a wall of music. Whereas with a higher end amp, everything kind of jumps out at you more. There's more dynamics. This really kind of lost on the dynamics compared to the bigger amps, but not quite so much in dynamics, but kind of the way they presented things which had the AKM DAC chip in them, such again as this Q5, sounded a little bit less engaging, much as the Magni 3 was a little bit less engaging compared to the multi-bit DACs, which just basically sounded more like I was listening to music. Now, in that, there are some interesting caveats about the setup. Now, if I switch on the Modi Multibit here, it's not plugged in via USB at the moment, but it takes a little bit of time to warm up, and you'll see the lights flicking there during its warm-up mode. But it won't go into USB mode because USB is not connected. And the reason for that is the USB bus in this thing is bus powered. That means it's powered using the power from whatever device it's plugged into. So if it's your computer, it will use the power from the computer. And computer USB power supplies are notoriously noisy. So I noticed a difference when listening to music with the Modi Multibit directly from my Mac Mini, which sits under my table here. And if I put something like Schiit Audio's Weird in between my computer and the Modi Multibit, and that distinctly made a jump up in sound. It wasn't something I needed to A/B, it was actually very noticeable. Now, of course, that would make, if you bought these two, that would make it a $350 DAC, and that's where things are starting to get a little bit expensive. I mean, this is a DAC amp set for $350, and then just a DAC for $350. Well, I mean, you can use the Audio GD R2R11, which I've already reviewed, just as a DAC as well, and it has a pretty good USB input. I found that probably just straight out of the Mac Mini, the Audio GD R2R11 was a tiny bit better than the Modi Multibit, but when I kind of even things up when I used it with the Weird in the chain, and of course this may vary depending on the computer you plug into. I mean, this is just my Mac Mini. Different computers might have different amounts of noise out of their USB ports, so I can't really be sure this will apply to everyone else. But it gave me a thought that, if you were going to spend more than, say, you wanted to spend the $350 on this kind of rig for a DAC, maybe it'd be better saving up for the Bifrost Multibit? Probably yes, because it has isolated USB and then you only have to buy one thing and not multiple components. But if you do have something with a good USB output and maybe you want to try a Multibit DAC, well, actually this would be a good candidate for something just to try to get an idea of what their sound is like. Now, of course, that sound compared to more expensive DACs isn't quite so detailed. To be realistic, these multi-bit DACs probably don't do better than 14-bit. So, I mean, a lot of DACs won't, no DAC really out there except Accord Dave will deliver absolutely perfectly reconstructed 16-bit. But all the same, technically, it probably will start to distort before you get down to the levels at which you would fully resolve 16 bits worth of data. And you probably see this if you, probably in measurements, and I don't have any measurements myself, but I'm sure that these things measure worse than things like this Q5. However, they do sound more entertaining, and I suppose it is a bit like using, say, instead of using the Magni, you might get a Valley 2. Now, the Valley 2 may not be technically as good as a Magni, but it sounds a lot better because of, well, the design. And especially if you get a nice tube with it, it actually would make for a very entertaining setup. So you'd have $250, then you have makes up to $400 adding this, and then a good tube. Maybe you'd end up being closer to $450 odd depending on the kind of tube you get. But it would make for a nice little stack to sit on a desk just for kind of relaxed and casual listening, where you don't care about hearing the ultra-fine details, but it will sound nicer than just plunking a radio on your desk or just plugging in your smartphone. And that's, I gather, is what Jason Stoddard of Schiit Audio actually listens with, is something like a little stack like this, instead of one of the big components, even though he could, if he wanted to have on his desk, have a Ragnarok, an Yggdrasil. It's just not, with him working all day, it's just not of interest to him to care about having the best component sitting generating heat all day. And for a lot of people who don't have a lot of desk space, something like this could be very entertaining. So as things go, if you're interested in comparison, how it sounded versus the Audio GD, so I thought the Audio GD sounded a tiny bit better. Now, an interesting thing with this is the Audio GD will accept 384K input through the USB. So you can actually use Roon or Audivana Plus or other upsamplers to improve things above the included filters a tiny bit more. So in terms of ultra musicality, and we're comparing cheaper components here, so don't take this as too much worry, I'd probably say the Audio GD sounded marginally better to my ears, but we're kind of 6 of one, half a dozen of the other. And the other thing is, the place people will see the Modi Multibit, or actually its technology, will probably be in a multi-bit DAC card in the back of something like the Lear 3. Now, all the same, these things, the Modi Multibit was definitely given a step up, going from something like the Magni to the Valley 2 or the Lear 3. If anything, I'd say that the Magni held it back. So, as again, I guess the combination, which I really liked at the beginning when this first arrived, was to plug it into the back of the Lear 3 and just enjoy listening, and for that it did a really good job. So if that does translate into the equivalent of buying a multi-bit DAC card for a Lear 3 and for just a simple one-box desktop rig, absolutely go for it. Even if the measurements are crap, it'll make for an enjoyable listening, because we don't listen to measurement sweeps, tones, or other such things, or white noise, which is also used for measurements. We listen to music, and enjoying music is kind of the primary aim of what we do when we buy this kind of gear. But if measurements are your thing, you're probably going to want to go for kind of the regular gear, such as this FIO. So that, I hope, was a good summary of the Modi Multibit DAC. If you do have any questions, comments, or criticisms, is there anything I've missed or you'd like I should have tried instead, do leave them in the comments below. Give them a thumbs up below if you did like my video. And also don't forget to subscribe, as there'll be many more videos like this with other components in this series.